I'm back with Debbie, and we were doing a little conversation about all these things swirling around in the news. We got a few things we wanted to talk about today. Let's start with this business about the House voting to remove Confederate statues. These are statues of people like Roger Taney, the Chief Justice who was the author of the Dred Scott decision, the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, and also Jefferson Davis, who was the President of the Confederacy. Now, during this debate, Kevin McCarthy, the GOP leader, made a very striking statement that I have to take a little bit of credit for, because this is a theme that I've been driving home in a series of movies, and you'll recognize it as soon as you hear it. So here's Kevin McCarthy making a point about these statues. Listen.
All the statues being removed by this bill are statues of Democrats. Madam Speaker, as I heard the Speaker talk earlier about removing of the 4 portraits of speakers in the hall, the same answer goes for that as well. They were all Democrats. What's interesting, the statues that need to be removed were sent to the Capitol by states that were majority controlled by Democrats, sent to a House that had a majority controlled by Democrats, accepting of these statues. I think the bill should go further. Maybe it's time the Democrats change the name of their party.
Now, that exposition I thought was terrific, but the solution, inadequate. What? Kevin McCarthy says the solution is to just change the name of the Democratic Party? This is like saying, you got the Nazi Party, it's done this, it's done that, but, why don't we change the name? What's that going to do? I think what they need to do is the Democratic Party needs to, number one, make a public admission of all its crimes. Acknowledge it's the party of slavery, of segregation, of Jim Crow, and of racial terrorism. We need a commission to make an inventory of these crimes, and I mean in all their specificity. The Trail of Tears, the unjust internment of the Japanese, all the slave camps, all the so-called Negro barbecues where they hung blacks on trees and ate burgers. It's all horrible. But we need to lay it out, and we need to lay it out on the Democratic Party. Then we need a public apology from the Democrats. And then finally, we need a willingness to pay reparations. I propose $1 trillion. A lot of rich Democrats can put money into this. The Democratic Party, as a party, needs to pay reparations to the black people who are descended from the slaves and the victimized blacks that they injured. And finally, stop blaming the GOP, which was the party that fought them all the way. The Democrats have very cleverly taken their crimes and tried to move them over to the other party. It's a sleight of hand operation. So with Kevin McCarthy and the GOP, it's not enough to expose the Democrats and name them, but it's important to hold them to account. That's, I think, the essential next step. And, of course, the point you are making, which is that you've seen this before. Unbelievably, even this stuff has a parallel.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say, we get a lot of letters, questions, not just audio and video, but we get a lot of written questions. And one of them was from Dwight. He says, I was wondering if you might be able to talk about something on your podcast. We hear a lot about socialism and the effect it's having on Venezuela. I even watched the PragerU video that your wife did, me, about her home country. I was hoping that maybe you could explain the appeal of socialism versus the reality of socialism. During all of this talk about racial division and about critical race theory and all of that, I just go back to the beginning of the end for Venezuela and how it started. People assumed that it was socioeconomically, that's what set it off. The division was socioeconomic. But I argue that it wasn't. It was actually racial division in that country. And there's plenty of sources on the internet. You can look for yourself about how this went to be. So let me just read to you. This is an Al Jazeera article from 2013. It's this African-American woman that wrote this for Al Jazeera. But the first thing she does is she puts a quote from Hugo Chavez. It says, Racism is very characteristic of imperialism and capitalism. Hate against me, Hugo Chavez, has a lot to do with racism because of my big mouth and curly hair, and I'm so proud to have this mouth and this hair because it's African. Hugo Chavez played up his African roots and his indigenous roots like there was no tomorrow. And he did this really as a way of dividing that country.
Well, let's set a little backdrop, because you've told me that in the Venezuela you grew up in, it was a multiracial society. You had people of every hue. You had Iranians and Italians and Asian Indians and black people and brown people and lighter-skinned people.
Yes.
And this reflected the sort of spectrum of Venezuela. So the idea of dividing Venezuela into two and driving a wedge,
yes,
Hugo Chavez started that.
Hugo Chavez did it, and he did it. The preamble of the new Constitution in 1999 that he did with his judges, right, states that Venezuela is a multi-ethnic and multicultural society that guarantees the right to life, to work, to culture, to education, to social justice, and the equality without discrimination or subordination. So basically, he admits this.
And this is sort of the language of critical race theory now.
This is exactly that.
Yeah, in other words, it's benign on its surface. Yeah, multi-ethnic, multiracial, no discrimination. But the way that these policies are carried out is discriminatory.
Absolutely is. And that also goes further. And he incorporated the Afro-Venezuelan Day into this. So he had to have that, not to be confused with the indigenous Venezuelan Day, which, remember that the statue of Christopher Columbus came down and was replaced by an indigenous man instead, right? So he definitely went there. Well,
I noticed that there were Venezuelan ships that had been named after, I guess, lighter-skinned Venezuelans who had won Miss Universe. And so he stripped those names off and he replaced them with the names of sort of native Indian names. So the same kind of purge of statues, of public monuments, and of history occurred in Venezuela. I would say it seems 20 years before it's come to the United States.
Absolutely. And here's another article. Chavez made Venezuela face reality of racism. It stems from all of this. So as I always say, yes, the road to socialism has many faces. This cry of racism is one of them. And don't confuse it with just, your little, this is going to be in my curriculum. I don't want my child to know this. This is all the roots that are being planted to prepare America for socialism. This is what Hugo Chavez did in Venezuela, and look at the disaster that happened there. And I'm very afraid that this is what's going to happen here.
So what you're saying is that when people talk about a statue, this is not really about Alexander Stevens. It's not really about Calhoun. It's not about, rather what it's about is an effort to purge the whole society, to disinfect it as they see it, of capitalist influence, imperialist influence. It's a massive remaking of the American mind as well as the school system. So in other words, it's replacing... It's establishing an official indoctrination system.
Absolutely.
Driven by Marxist and critical race theory.
Absolutely. And just like parents are upset about it in America, the same phenomenon happened in Venezuela. Parents were just livid that their children were being indoctrinated in this way. Many of them cried out. They had signs, "Leave my child alone," "Not here," "You don't do this here to my kid." And look at what's happened.
When we come back, we're going to dive into Bill Cosby and Trump at the border and a couple of other pressing issues.